Let's look at the next one. Here you've seen earlier on, you saw descendant used with types, used with elements. Well, here's descendant ID. Similar but slightly different. Let me show you what's going on here. Here the rule states where there's a span that's followed by an ID of my ID. So in other words, if you have a span that has the ID of my ID, then set its decoration to underline. So here we go. Here's a span that has the ID of my ID and it's set to underlined. Now, to show the difference between that and div my ID, for example, the fact that the my ID isn't being applied on its own and only gets applied underneath the element before because it's a descendant shows that this span my ID creates an underline and this div my ID here creates a line through. So they both use IDs of my ID. So this is one of those exceptions that I mentioned in an earlier walkthrough where you can use the same ID more than once, but the only way we've been able to do this is by making it a descendant of another element, and then we can say, okay, when you have a span called my ID, do this, or here when you have a div called my ID, do that. So there you go with descendant IDs. Now classes, we saw classes before, but let's have a look again. Here we have my class. This is notified by prefacing it with a period or a dot or full stop, and when the class is used then its left margin should be set to 30 pixels indent. So let's have a look at that. Here's a paragraph. There and there you can see the opening and closing tag, and then here the class of my class is being applied, and lo and behold the whole paragraph has been indented by this amount here on the left, which is 30 pixels. Now, as with types and IDs, you can have descendant class. So let's look at this example here. This says where you have a paragraph that uses the class main, indent the contents by 60 pixels. So let's have a look at this in action. On the left here we have the paragraph. You can see the opening closing tags, and the class applied is main. Okay, and as you can see on the left here the indent is now 60 pixels because the descendant class has been applied to this tag. Okay, there's a few selector types left, so and they're a little bit more unusual now, and the following ones you might use, some of them you might use a little bit less than others, but you need to know about them anyway. So let's now look at the attribute selector. So here, for example, we'll look at the attribute of submit, which you'll often see on a button, or you might see it in a form, in an input type. Input type equals submit, for example. So what this rule says is where an element has the attribute type and its value is submit, set its color to blue. And that's been done here with this submit button. It's been automatically, all submit buttons or all elements that have the attribute type and whose value of that type is submit will be shown in blue. So that's a very simple way to style parts of buttons and so on. Now, as well as going for the attribute directly, you can also address its descendants just the same way that we've been doing with classes and IDs and so on. So let's have a look at this. Here, for example, form. So when we start off with a form and it has an input which has a type attribute with the value of submit, then change its text color to red. So here, for example, we have a form and then there's an input with the type of submit underneath it, and that's been set to the color of red. Okay, now let's look at the last three types of selectors, and the next one is really powerful. It's the universal selector, and you use an asterisk for that one. So here, for example, asterisk font family times. So what's happened in this is that the whole document that you're looking at here, this whole web page, is displayed in times purely because this class here says everything must be shown in times. That's what that star there says. Okay, now underneath that I want to show you descendant universal, which is a much more precise way of handling the universal selector. In this case, I want to show you this rule, which says take a class of box out, and then if there's anything at all inside it that also inside that contains a span, then give it a border that's 1 pixel wide, solid, and in green. Let's look through exactly how that works. So for example, here's a div, and there's the closing div. So there, the class box out is applied to the div. So this is where the first one comes in, where the class of box out is applied. Okay, it's being applied to this div. Now, where there's anything and then a span, set it to green. Okay, at the moment this is just the regular text following the box out, so nothing happens there. Then there's a span and the closing span. That's no good because it's not anything span, it's directly to the span. So this is also ignored by the rule. However, if we go down to this next one here, we're in a div with a class of box out. Now we're inside a span, and now we're inside another span, and it has the border. So what's happened here is we've got the box out class there, then there's a span, then there's another span. It could have been box out, then a div, then a span, box out, then italics, then a span, box out anything, and then a span, and then you get the border. Now you might not get your head around exactly why you'd want to do this at the moment, but as you start using CSS more and more, you will find places where the universal selector comes in quite handy, and you'll be glad that you're aware of how to use it. Let's now look at using groups when selecting elements for CSS rules. So for example, here's one just there, and let's look at that on the web page. So here's the rule again, and let's see what this says. Here there's the period, so that signifies a class. So where there's a class with the name class name, then set its bottom border to 1 pixel dotted in orange. And here we have a div with the class of class name, and lo and behold, the bottom border there is dotted orange. At the same time, the use of this comma here says also if there's an ID with the name of ID name, then apply the rule to that as well. And you can have as many commas as you like. For example, here you could keep saying or all paragraphs should have that, and any italics should be like that, and any classes called Fred, and so on, separated by commas. This allows you to share a rule across many different classes, and is a good way of making compact code, because without using grouping you'd need to write that rule over and over again for each one of these items. Instead, you can just list all the items that are going to use that rule, separate them by commas, and there you go.